August 1944. Somewhere in the Pacific, the jungle breathes in silence. A captured Japanese soldier sits beneath a shredded palm, wrists bound, eyes vacant. Around him, the wreckage of his regiment steams in the midday heat. Twisted rifles, burned helmets, and the metallic stench of cordite clinging to the air. For months, he had been told the Americans were soft, a nation of luxury and machines, a people incapable of endurance or sacrifice. Yet now, those same weak enemies had unleashed a storm of iron that erased his position in minutes. Naval shells the size of tree trunks had turned bunkers into craters. Waves of aircraft had swept the sky clean. The ground itself had thundered beneath their advance. When U.S. Marines finally emerged through the smoke, their faces were blackened with soot. Quiet, methodical, unshaken. No hesitation, no visible fear. The prisoner looks up at them, trembling, not from pain, but realization. Everything he had believed about the enemy has just died in front of him. The question now was how such firepower came to exist, and what drove America to wield it so completely. Before the war began, the Japanese military machine viewed the United States through a lens of arrogance and misunderstanding. The Imperial Japanese Army and Navy, shaped by decades of samurai heritage and victory over Russia in 1905, believed moral willpower outweighed industrial strength. To them, Western soldiers lacked spirit. They fought for paychecks, not for emperors or honor. This belief ran deep within every officer's education. In military academies across Tokyo and Osaka, instructors taught that spiritual superiority, the Yamato Damashi, could overcome any mechanical disadvantage. When Japan struck Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, the attack was not just strategic, it was ideological. The planners saw it as a decisive blow that would shatter America's morale before it could mobilize. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, however, understood the deeper danger. "We can run wild for 6 months," he warned, "but after that, I have no expectation of success." He had studied in the United States. He knew its factories, its steel, its oil, and its will when provoked. Still, Japan's early victories reinforced the illusion of American weakness. Within months, the rising sun flag flew over Guam, Wake Island, Hong Kong, and the Philippines. The fall of Singapore and the capture of tens of thousands of Allied troops further fed the myth that the West could be broken quickly, that industrial power meant nothing without spirit. Japanese propaganda films showed caricatures of clumsy, soft-faced Americans surrendering before the noble imperial soldier. But that illusion began to crack in the coral waters of Midway in June 1942. In just a few hours, 4 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, lay burning beneath the Pacific waves. American dive bombers, flying through walls of flak, had reversed the course of the war. It was the first time Japanese soldiers realized that their enemy could think, adapt, and strike with precision. Yet even then, many officers dismissed Midway as luck, an aberration, not a pattern. Then came Guadalcanal, August 1942 to February 1943, 6 months of rain, jungle, and starvation. On that small, hellish island, Japanese troops encountered something they had never expected: American endurance. The U.S. Marines dug in under relentless attack, surviving malaria, supply shortages, and night assaults. They did not retreat. They counterattacked. For the first time, captured Japanese diaries revealed confusion and respect. "They fight like demons," one wrote. Another, "The enemy does not tire. Their ships return again and again." Behind that endurance lay something invisible to the battlefield eye, an industrial machine unlike anything Japan could comprehend. While Tokyo's factories scraped for resources, America's industrial heartland roared awake. From Detroit to Seattle, assembly lines built planes faster than Japan could shoot them down. Shipyards on both coasts launched new vessels every few days. Between 1942 and 1944, U.S. war production outpaced Japan's by a ratio of nearly 10 to 1. The Japanese had trained their men to endure hardship. The Americans trained their machines to end wars. And with each passing month, those machines grew more precise, more deadly, more relentless. From the skies over Rabaul to the jungles of New Guinea, reports began to reach Tokyo of overwhelming artillery, of naval bombardments that flattened entire positions, of flamethrowers and tanks tearing through cave defenses once thought impregnable. But still, Japan's command refused to adjust its perception. Honor demanded belief in the invincible spirit of the soldier. By late 1943, that belief would collide head-on with a new kind of war. One built on coordination, technology, and logistics, where courage alone no longer guaranteed victory. And as American Marines prepared to land on the next island, the world's most advanced amphibious assault doctrine was about to meet the world's most determined defenders. By the end of 1943, the United States had mastered something Japan never fully understood: the science of coordinated destruction. The island assault doctrine, refined through blood and error, became the backbone of America's advance across the Pacific. Each landing was no longer a gamble. It was an engineered sequence: reconnaissance, bombardment, amphibious armor, infantry waves, and immediate air cover. The concept was simple, but devastating. Before a single Marine touched the sand, the island would be pounded by naval guns and carrier-based aircraft for days. Every trench, cave, and bunker was mapped from aerial photographs. Then came the landing craft, hundreds of steel vessels surging toward the shore in perfect timing. Behind them, floating docks, bulldozers, and medical units followed like clockwork. It was not merely warfare, it was industrial choreography. Japanese defenders, trained for frontal courage and bayonet charges, were trapped in a doctrine centuries old. Their positions were fortified, but they fought in isolation, unable to resupply, cut off from air support, and ordered never to surrender. From Tarawa to Saipan, many believed the Americans would falter once the first wave was repelled. Instead, the bombardment erased entire defensive networks before contact. What followed shocked even seasoned Japanese officers. Tanks rolled over trenches once thought safe from mechanized assault. Flamethrower teams advanced with brutal precision, clearing bunkers one by one. Every movement was supported by artillery and naval coordination that seemed endless. Prisoners later recalled that the ground shook like the sky was falling, an assault unlike anything they had ever faced. Meanwhile, American intelligence units and interrogation centers began collecting testimonies from captured soldiers. The pattern was consistent: disbelief. Many POWs admitted they had been told Americans lacked discipline, that their democracy made them weak. Yet in captivity, they saw organization, efficiency, and sheer volume. Food, medicine, and weapons delivered in quantities Japan could no longer imagine. Each report, each interrogation, painted the same picture: an empire of spirit facing an empire of production. Japan's warriors still believed in death before dishonor, but slowly the image of an unprepared America faded. It was being replaced by the reality of overwhelming firepower, a force that did not rely on bravery alone, but on calculation, steel, and unstoppable supply lines. And as the next campaigns approached, the Marianas, Pilaliu, Iwo Jima, that realization would shatter the last illusions of Japanese invincibility. The human illusion. For many Japanese soldiers, the belief in American weakness was not propaganda. It was faith. Raised in a militarized society that glorified death for the emperor, they saw surrender as the ultimate disgrace. In their eyes, any army that valued life over death was unworthy of victory. American culture, Its consumer goods, movies, and democracy was mocked as decadent softness. This conviction gave Japanese troops immense psychological resilience, but also sealed their fate. When they finally faced U.S. forces on Pacific Islands, that illusion broke in silence, not speeches. They saw soldiers who fought not for an emperor, but for each other. Disciplined, organized, unshaken by loss. Marines who, when wounded, were pulled back and replaced instantly by fresh ranks. To the Japanese, this was alien. A machine made of men, not driven by ideology, but by unity and purpose. POW interrogations later revealed a kind of stunned respect. They fight as if death is nothing special, one prisoner noted, but they do not throw it away. That difference between reckless sacrifice and strategic persistence defined the new enemy Japan faced. The tactical revolution. The Pacific War was not only a clash of armies, but of systems. Japan's tactics were rooted in the belief that courage could substitute for firepower. The U.S. proved otherwise. Every major operation, from Tarawa to Leyte, became a demonstration of calculated precision. Amphibious assaults were rehearsed down to the minute. Engineers, artillery officers, naval gunners, and pilots worked in synchronization unseen in modern warfare. Before each landing, the sea and sky turned into engines of destruction. Naval barrages measured in tons per square mile reduced coral fortresses to dust. Then waves of aircraft strafed anything that moved. When Marines finally landed, they brought portable radios, air controllers, and field artillery, integrating communication in ways Japan could not match. Each assault was a living diagram of doctrine. Japanese commanders tried to adapt, building tunnels, dispersing troops, hiding guns under camouflage. But coordination required technology, and Japan was running out of it. Radios failed, ammunition dwindled, and air cover vanished. Tactical superiority was no longer measured by bravery but by bandwidth, by how many voices could speak and strike at once. At this stage of the war, the psychological and tactical foundations of Japan's empire were cracking, not from moral weakness, but from collision with a modern war machine that had rewritten the rules of battle. The technological shock shattered Japanese confidence more than the sheer sophistication of American technology. At first, imperial troops dismissed the enemy's reliance on machines as weakness, an addiction to comfort that would collapse under hardship. But when U.S. bombers and artillery began leveling entire positions in minutes, that belief died quickly. American firepower was unlike anything the Pacific had ever seen. The M4 Sherman tank, though not the most powerful in Europe, was an unstoppable force on the islands. Supported by bulldozers, flamethrowers, and self-propelled guns, it erased bunkers once thought untouchable. Naval guns, firing shells weighing over 1,000 pounds, crushed fortifications from miles offshore. Overhead, the F-6F Hellcat and B-25 Mitchell carved the sky into domination. To the Japanese, who still relied on light tanks and fixed defenses, this was not warfare. It was annihilation by industry. POW interrogations often included the same phrase, "The Americans have endless weapons." And it was true. Every Marine assault was backed by a logistical chain so vast that Japan's entire empire could not equal a single American fleet's capacity. The myth of technological inferiority was not merely disproven, it was obliterated. Leadership and doctrine behind America's firepower stood leadership that learned, adapted, and refused to repeat mistakes. Figures like Admiral Chester Nimitz and General Douglas MacArthur represented two different strategies. One naval, one amphibious, but both driven by relentless analysis. After every battle, U.S. commanders revised doctrine, studied enemy behavior, and integrated new technology. The result was a feedback loop of improvement that Japan, bound by rigid hierarchy, could not replicate. In Japan's command structure, questioning superiors bordered on treason. In America's, it was encouraged, as long as it led to victory. Junior officers on the ground could call in naval fire or air support without waiting for permission. Intelligence teams translated captured documents, tested enemy weapons, and turned every encounter into a lesson. By 1944, each landing was not just a fight, but an experiment, perfected in real time. While Japanese generals clung to outdated visions of the Banzai charge, Americans built a war of mathematics, communication, and coordination. Leadership had shifted from pride to pragmatism. The results would soon become undeniable and catastrophic for Japan's forces trapped across the Pacific. The convergence of these human, tactical, technological, and leadership angles formed a single truth. Japan was facing a kind of warfare it had never prepared for. And in the coming battles, that realization would reach its breaking point. Tarawa, November 20th, 1943. The lagoon was calm, too calm. Beneath its turquoise surface lay coral reefs that would trap hundreds of landing craft, leaving Marines to wade through chest-deep water under fire. From the Japanese perspective, it was perfect. The 4,500 defenders of the Ito, Heitai, the elite 7th Sasebo Special Naval Landing Force, believed no force on Earth could take Betio Island in less than a week. The American assault began with a sound the Japanese had never heard before. A wall of thunder rolling from the sea, battleships Maryland and Colorado, cruisers Portland and Minneapolis, and destroyers encircling the island unleashed over 3,000 tons of shells in 3 hours. The earth itself lifted. Concrete bunkers evaporated. To the defenders, it was as if a god of fire had descended. When the bombardment stopped, Japanese survivors crept from their ruins, only to see the horizon black with approaching craft. LVT alligators, amphibious tractors bristling with 50-caliber guns, churned toward shore. The Marines of the 2nd Division, led by General Julian C. Smith, hit the beaches under withering resistance. What followed was chaos, men drowning in the reef, machine gun fire cutting through the surf, officers rallying under mortar bursts. But they kept advancing. Inch by inch, yard by yard, they closed in. By the second night, the Japanese command structure was shattered. Captain Keiji Shibasaki, the island's commander, had boasted that 1,000,000 men couldn't take Tarawa in 100 years. He was dead before sunset on the first day. The next morning, Marines pushed through burned coconut bunkers and collapsed pillboxes, flamethrowers clearing every shadow. The final Japanese counterattack, a desperate Banzai charge of nearly 300 men, was mowed down in minutes by combined rifle and machine gun fire. When silence finally fell on Betio after 76 hours of fighting, 17 Japanese were taken alive. Over 4,600 lay dead. For the surviving defenders, the myth of invincibility had ended. The soft Americans had crossed reefs under fire, fought through fortified lines, and annihilated an entire garrison in less than 4 days. From that point onward, Japan's perception of its enemy could no longer survive untouched. And on the horizon of 1944, even greater tests awaited. On islands far larger, with stakes far higher, where Japan would face not just endurance, but annihilation by scale. When the smoke cleared across the Central Pacific, the cost was counted in silence. The battles that shattered Japan's myth of superiority also tore through American ranks with brutal arithmetic. Tarawa alone claimed over 1,000 U.S. dead and 2,000 wounded, a price paid for just 72 hours of combat. Saipan tripled those losses. The U.S. counted more than 14,000 casualties, while the Japanese garrison of 30,000 was nearly wiped out. Barely 1,000 survived. But behind those numbers lay something more profound: the capture of Japan's soldiers, alive. Until Tarawa and Saipan, surrender to the enemy was seen as impossible. Now, increasing numbers of Japanese troops, dazed and wounded, were being taken prisoner. Each one represented a crack in the old code of Bushido. They spoke of hunger, exhaustion, and disbelief. Disbelief that America could summon such endless firepower. Disbelief that their own empire had failed to provide. The same U.S. intelligence teams recorded their words with quiet efficiency. Reports from the Joint Intelligence Center, Pacific Ocean Areas, JEICPOA, noted recurring themes: shock at the volume of American artillery, awe at the coordination between air and sea, and confusion at the Americans' compassion toward prisoners. Many POWs admitted they had expected to be executed. Instead, they received food, bandages, and cigarettes. For some, this kindness was more devastating than any shell. It contradicted years of indoctrination that portrayed Americans as barbaric. Meanwhile, the material destruction was staggering. On Saipan, entire towns, Garapan, Charankanoa, were flattened. Thousands of Japanese civilians caught in the crossfire or coerced into suicide by propaganda perished alongside the soldiers. Naval bombardments had reshaped the landscape itself, leveling hills and leaving craters the size of houses. U.S. engineers described the island as a cemetery carved by steel. For America, these victories validated a strategy of total integration: air, land, and sea operating as one. War production soared even higher. In 1944 alone, the U.S. Navy launched more ships than Japan had built in the entire war. Aircraft rolled off assembly lines at a pace that defied imagination. Nearly 100,000 planes that year alone. The industrial machine Yamamoto had once feared was now in full stride. For Japan, every loss forced reflection among its surviving officers, though few dared speak it aloud. The realization was inescapable. Courage could no longer shield them from annihilation. The Americans were not fighting the same war. They were fighting a war of capacity, not courage. A war decided in factories as much as in foxholes. As these truths rippled through military ranks and filtered into secret reports sent to Tokyo, they reached ears unprepared for their implications. The illusion of invincibility had died, and now Japan faced a reckoning far greater than the loss of territory. In the months that followed the island campaigns, Japan entered a slow descent into strategic and psychological collapse. The loss of Saipan in July 1944 was more than a military defeat. It was a fracture in national consciousness. For the first time, American bombers could now reach Tokyo directly. The home islands, once shielded by vast stretches of ocean, were suddenly within range of destruction. Japanese military leadership reacted with a mix of desperation and denial. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo resigned soon after Saipan's fall, acknowledging, privately if not publicly, that the war's trajectory had become irreversible. Yet his successors clung to the same fatal logic: that willpower and sacrifice could offset material inferiority. Every report from the front contradicted that belief. Soldiers returned from Guam and Tinian speaking in whispers about the sea of ships and the sky that burned with planes. Their superiors silenced them. Fearing morale collapse, civilian morale, too, began to fracture under the weight of truth and propaganda. Families received letters written months earlier by sons who were now dead. Local newspapers, heavily censored, replaced casualty lists with stories of glorious resistance. But the rumors spread anyway, of mass suicides on Saipan cliffs, of mothers clutching children as they leapt into the sea rather than face capture. These stories, retold in homes and temples, began to corrode the faith that Japan could ever achieve victory through sacrifice alone. U.S. intelligence officers studying intercepted communications noted a profound shift in tone. Reports once filled with confidence now spoke of unfavorable tactical realities, and strained resources. By 1945, Japan's oil reserves had fallen to less than 6 months of operational supply. Aircraft production, crippled by bombing and material shortages, could not match the losses at the front. The Imperial Navy, once the pride of the nation, was now largely confined to port, its great ships immobilized for lack of fuel. Psychologically, the POW reports captured by the Americans became the most damning evidence of the empire's unraveling. Interrogations from Guam and Peleliu revealed officers openly questioning the emperor's infallibility, a crime unthinkable only 2 years earlier. One captured lieutenant described his realization bluntly. "The Americans fight with science, not emotion. We fight with emotion, and now we are running out." Back in Tokyo, these accounts filtered through the inner circles of the military bureaucracy, though many were suppressed before reaching the public. Yet the damage was irreversible. Each defeat chipped away at the moral armor of the Japanese fighting spirit. The final stage of the war, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and the firebombing of Japan would merely confirm what the island battles had already proven, that the empire's destiny was no longer written in valor, but in industrial mathematics. The question that now lingered was not whether Japan could win, but how it would survive the collapse of the world it had built upon illusion. When history turns silent, it often leaves behind echoes more powerful than the sounds of war. The Pacific Islands, once jungles and coral plains, became places of memory, where technology and human will collided in their purest, most brutal forms. What began as a clash of nations had evolved into a confrontation between belief and reality. The faith in human courage against the cold arithmetic of industrial warfare. The American victory was not simply a triumph of machines, it was the moment when modern warfare declared its independence from heroism. The assembly line replaced the sword. Strategy became science. Air power, logistics, and mechanization rewrote the ancient rules of battle that had governed soldiers for centuries. Yet in that transformation, something essential was lost. The illusion that war could still be personal, or noble, or bound by honor. For Japan, the revelation was shattering. Its warriors had entered the Pacific, convinced that the human spirit could outlast steel. They left behind a record of sacrifice unmatched in scale and futility. But through that collapse, the world glimpsed a truth it has never forgotten. That courage, however absolute, cannot sustain an empire built on myth. The captured soldiers who once swore they would never surrender found themselves questioning not only their commanders, but the entire moral architecture of their nation. The Americans who faced them, meanwhile, carried their own burden. The awareness that victory, achieved through overwhelming force, still exacted a terrible cost on the soul. Both sides, in their own way, stepped into the modern age of war, where survival demanded not just bravery, but comprehension. Today, the ruins of those islands remain. Rusting tanks overgrown with vines, helmets half buried in coral, relics of an era when humanity first realized what it could truly destroy. The Pacific became both a graveyard and a warning that industrial power without empathy leads only to annihilation, and that belief without understanding breeds tragedy. What the jungle swallowed in 1944 was not only men and machines, but an entire vision of what war once meant. Out of that devastation arose a new question, not of victory or defeat, but of memory itself. How we remember courage in an age that made courage obsolete.